Hi, welcome back to the channel. Michelle, and today I'm going to be talking about how I establish expectations in my homeschooling and how I help my children reach those expectations. So the first, thing to talk about is what is an expectation, because I do think that there is confusion about the difference between a responsibility and an expectation. So the responsibility is the thing you're responsible for. The expectation is, okay, but what does that finished product look like? So I've used in the past the example of cleaning your room, right? It's responsibility to clean your room. The expectation is, okay, but what does a clean room look like? What are the steps taken to reach that goal? So it's the same thing with homeschooling. So expectations is, what does it look like, the finished product? And what are the skills necessary to get to that finished product? So I can't just say, go to school. What does that mean for my kids? It's time for school. School means that all of their subject areas, whatever's on their schedule, is finished for the day. But it's more detailed than that. It's subject by subject, what is expected for that specific area. But one of the expectations is that these subject areas are covered before things like screen time. My kids do school first thing in the morning, usually depending on when we start, 8:30 to 1, and then after that they have the freedom to do what they want and screen time available. That's one of the boundaries I set up to kind of help motivate that school is a priority in this house, and that's something that is very clear to my kids. But I think it's really important that you have things like schedules, whether that be planners or visual schedules. I have visual schedules, link up above our schedule for this year. It hasn't really changed much since that video. So if you want to see our schedule, check that out. But having the schedules is essential in my homeschool because of a couple of reasons. One, they can see daily what they have to do. Nothing's a surprise. Everything flows smoothly because they're familiar with the schedule. It doesn't change. I'm not constantly dropping or changing things. Our schedule stays the same. And this is a lot of work on my part, figuring out, tweaking it of what works. And there are some times you don't know what's going to work until you're into it. For example, Phonetic Zoo, I didn't know how that would go this year, but it was on the schedule for a specific time. And that really helps my kids know what's coming next, what's expected, what are we doing today. And I think most kids do benefit from that kind of consistency and that kind of scheduling, just because the flow, the transition, everything moves a lot easier when they know what is coming. So, for example, the schedule looks different for each of my kids because although there are expectations, the skills getting to that goal is going to look different for different kids and even different age groups. My oldest is 11, my youngest daughter is 7, my youngest child is 4.5. So it's going to look different for each child. So for example, scheduling with my oldest, because again, scheduling helps them know what is needed to be done. I'm going to get into specific subject areas, but let's go over schedule first. So my oldest, she has a lot of freedom in her schedule because she's been homeschooling for the last 4 years. She is used to the expectations of our homeschool, what is needed from her. So she has a lot more freedom in that. And I think that is something that a lot of people work towards, that independence, but you definitely have to scaffold it over the years. It's not something you can just plop down in a fifth grader's lap and say, hey, do this. You have to make sure the skills are there necessary to do it. So we've worked on the skills necessary to do some independent work over the years, and some curriculum does it naturally. For example, Lightning Literature with my oldest naturally builds up to a level of independence. But for her, she can choose the order. Like I have a list of her subject. She doesn't necessarily have to do it in that order. She can choose to start at 9 when we normally do. She has been starting earlier than that because she really likes to get her stuff done. So she's got freedom in that choice. And I was watching a parent summit for ADHD conference series lately. And one of the things they were talking about was when children feel like they have more control of a situation, their anxiety level goes down. So your child is going to be less anxious if they feel like they have a say in it. Now, to say that, I don't think a fifth grader should be choosing their curriculum. I do think when they get older, they should definitely have more of a say in it. You can definitely get their feedback in it, but ultimately you're the educator here. You need to be making some of those decisions, but you can absolutely come to them and be like, these are the 2 options I have, and let them choose from that. Because again, they're gonna push back less if they feel like they have a choice in it. And I have found that my daughter really does well with that choice and that freedom, but that's also something that I've scaffolded over the years with just getting her ready for that level of independence. For my 7-year-old, for her schedule, she doesn't want that freedom or independence. That gives her anxiety. She is an ADHD child. She likes structure. She likes things to be this, rigid, same thing they are. So she likes to go, each subject, how we always do it. And that works well for her brain, for retention, but also for transition. She doesn't have difficulty transitioning because she knows, okay, this is what we do next. There's not this, convincing my kids to do school, because this is what we do. And then for my youngest, it's simple as, he also chooses. I will lay out his things, and he'll choose what order he does things. And one of the things that has been really beneficial for this particular child, because he's more stubborn, is, again, the choice. If he feels like he has more choice in what's going on, he's going to be a lot more willing to do it. The simple choice of words, wordplay. So instead of saying, it's time for school, questioning, are you ready for school? Most of the time he'll say yes, and sometimes he won't. And I just inform him that that's fine if he wants to wait later, but I'm going to go work with his older sisters to get their work started, which means before we do school, to get school done, he's going to have to wait for me until the end of that then. And he understands that. And, there's a handful of times he's chosen to wait until we're done with, the bulk of my older kids' work. He doesn't really like that, though, because, again, keep in mind, his tablet, his screen time hinders on having school done first. So he's already putting it in his mind, prioritizing, which is really important to have your kids be able to prioritize these things, because school is really important. We shouldn't be pushing it off. Doctor's appointments, certain things come up that are unavoidable, absolutely. But we shouldn't be pushing it off just because we don't want to. I think that's a bad message to be sending to our kids. So even at 4.5, my son is realizing that to do this, I have to do this first, which again is going to help you in the long run. But that kind of shows you how they each have schedules, right? But I have to adjust how that is approached. The skill set that they have is different, so that's going to look different for each child. I do think it's really important that we set parameters in homeschooling so they really have an idea, okay, this is what the finished product looks like, or this is what we're going to be doing, and this is the box in which we work within. And that sounds constrictive, and I know that's not really popular in homeschooling, freedom and all this, but children really do work within parameters, really good boundaries set. They do know how to operate better, and it's easier for them, less anxious for them if they know the details of what you're doing and how to do that. That being said, there is an amount of flexibility that comes with homeschooling, absolutely. So for example, setting the parameters. So for my oldest, she does IEW, she does writing. That is nicely laid out already for her, day by day. It tells her what to do, it's got a little checklist, everything that is needed for that. That's great scaffolding right there. And I don't have to do any of that scaffolding. It's right there. My only job is to check it, make sure it's getting done, which is great. But there is flexibility in that. For example, her assignment this past week was to do a paper on somebody she knows. And she wanted to adjust it and do an autobiography, a paper specifically on herself, talking about certain interests. So she approached me again. Communication is key in homeschooling. Your children need to understand that there's parameters, there's expectations, but that you are open to discuss these. So she came to me and asked if she could write about herself. And I said, as long as you have everything that is needed in that paper, you are absolutely fine to do it by yourself. But there are times that we cannot be flexible. So for example, she was finishing up, she watched the first half of the video, it was like 45 minutes. The second half was about 15 minutes longer. She's like, can I start writing my paper before I finish the second half? And I said, no, you can't. And that's a solid no. Why is that a solid no? Because whatever is in that last 15 minutes, I guarantee you, probably has something to do with her paper, and she needs to do that. And that's another thing, not just giving them a yes or no answer, but really explaining to them why we're doing it this way. And this is really helpful for my oldest when I do occasionally get pushback for her, or why do I have to do this? I will explain to her that, I'm not giving her busy work, things to keep her, busy. Everything has a purpose. So, if she's asking, why am I doing this punctuation book? It's because I've noticed you have some weaknesses in that area, and we need to work more on punctuation. And from working on that, her writing has improved because the mechanics have improved. So she's definitely at that age where she's kind of see and trust me in this, that if I'm giving her something, it's for a reason. So I do think explaining, especially, for my 7-year-old with ADHD, explaining why we're doing something, why we're particularly doing this subject or this supplemental material in particular is really important, so that they don't feel like you're just throwing more and more at them. But to a point, you should also have a reason you're giving them these things besides that it's pretty and you want to do it. You need to have more reason than that to be giving your child work to do. So that's an example for my oldest of, kind of how there's a solid no and there's some flexibility. So an example for my 7-year-old is we do group subjects, science and history, and those subjects are aimed at my oldest daughter. So there are things definitely above her head. So, adjusting for that is, for the expectation in science is that my 11-year-old be writing out the lab sheets and the information and doing the diagrams. The expectation, because again, my 11-year-old has those skill abilities to do that, it's age appropriate, she needs to practice. My 7-year-old does not have those abilities. She has the ability to learn the information, absolutely. So a lot of the questions I will do orally with her, and if there's a diagram or drawing, she can absolutely do that. I'll print out a second page for her and she'll make the diagram. We recently were doing photosynthesis, and she was able to make a diagram of that completely fine. Well, the expectation for my older child was that she made the diagram but also answered the questions in writing, because I think that's a really important skill in middle school to be having. I don't think we should solely rely on oral communication skills. They have to be able to put pen to paper. So that's an example of flexibility in homeschooling. Having those parameters that this is what I expect to be done, but being flexible in that to a certain point, but having your solid no's so they know exactly where those boundary lines are. And one of the things that I have found really helpful with our subject areas, getting to specific subjects, is when we start subjects, the first few weeks, I walk them through it, even if it's an independent program. So, for example, Lightning Literature, my oldest has been doing that since 3rd grade. She's very familiar with it, but we will walk through the first couple of weeks together just so she's sure of how it gets done, building those skills, making sure those skills are there. If any questions come up, I'm right there, we're going through it. I can see right away if there's an issue. This isn't such an issue with, my younger two, because I'm there no matter what. But when you bring on independence, you absolutely have to have those checks and marks. And I find working alongside them, even if they're older, even if they're independent during those first few weeks, is really important. And I do think there's unfortunately a push for independence in homeschooling way before a child's ready or necessarily has the skills ready for independence, just because it's easier for the parent or they need them to do this independent thing. And I get it, life circumstances are different for everybody, but if your child does not have the skill set in order to do this, then you can't put them in their lap and then get mad that they didn't learn it. Their education, that's kind of on you. If they didn't understand something, that's on you. That's a signal to you as the parent, the educator, that something didn't work. There's a lot of direct instruction in a homeschool, which I think is kind of, overlooked, that I think people focus way too much on, learning styles and how best your child learns, but they're forgetting about the whole other section of teaching strategies. Yeah, learning styles, how to get that information to your kid, how best they will receive that information is important, but also teaching strategies, different ways you can work with your child to best relay that information for them. So I suggest looking more at that other spectrum of our responsibility on that end, especially when we're leaning into independence, making sure we're scaffolding it, that they have the skill ability, that they have the emotional maturity, that they have the time management skill. Time management, independence takes a lot of time management. Luckily, my oldest is very good in this area and she can manage her time very well, but not all kids are. That's why you have to set up time management skills. And that's something as simple as with my 7-year-old with her ADHD workbook, setting up what can you do? And the example given in the book was to build a ladder. Each step to get to your goal is step 1, step 2, step 3. And even to take it farther, take the biggest problem or the smallest problem and do that first and work your way up. So being able to show them those skills, I think, is really helpful, not only in school, but in life, because learning to prioritize time management, those things are all life skills. Talking about, the parent responsibility on this, and there is a huge parent responsibility, even with the independent subject, that, I expect you to finish this, but on the same, there's expectations that I am checking it daily, making sure the work is being done, that understanding is happening, especially if your child's more independent or older, where they have that more freedom, you have to definitely be on your game and make sure you're doing these things, because it's very easy to get complacent or honestly lazy with it and not check it, and they're skipping things on accident or purpose, or they didn't get a concept, it was fuzzy to them, but they were able to squeak by in what they knew. Like, again, even if they're independent, you still have to be really involved in checking things, and that's already built into my oldest schedule, that during lunch I'm checking her work. We do the math lesson we do dimensions math, we do the textbook lesson together, and then she does the workbook independently. So I'm checking her math, I'm checking her lightning literature, I'm checking whatever supplemental workbook she has during that time frame, so I can give immediate feedback to her that, okay, this was missed, or you forgot this. Sometimes, it's just a simple mistake, like in lightning literature. She only did one part of what was assigned. She was supposed to underline and circle something. She only underlined whatever was being asked. She forgot that. So it's just a simple mistake sometimes. But catching those things, because again, these are kids. They're still learning. They need direct instruction. They need that teacher presence to make sure that they're learning. So I want to give you guys some specific examples, because I do think real life examples are helpful. And again, my situation is unique to my kids, my family, so it's not across the board. But I do think, when I'm reading books, if I get examples of the situations, it is helpful. So I want to talk about math, because I briefly touched on that. We use dimensions math with, my two older kids. My younger son will eventually get into it as well. But for my oldest, like I said, we do the textbook lesson together. So I teach the direct instruction. There are practice problems in the textbook. We go through those step by step together. Again, you want to model the I do, the teaching, the instruction, the we do, the practice together, walking them through it, and then you do. They are able to retrieve that information and walk those steps together. So that's exactly what happens with dimensions with my oldest. And if there's a problem in the, when she's working on the workbook independently, she calls me in again, open communication. And that's me responding. If I'm working with another child, I can say, hey, can you hold on a minute? But that's not me playing on my phone. That's not me watching YouTube videos and telling my kid to hang on. I don't have my phone out during school hours. That's prioritizing what they need. Because again, if you're kind of shoving them off or blowing them off, they're going to get the idea that this isn't important. Why do I have to learn this if mom's not even paying attention to what we're doing? Again, a lot of that messaging is they're going to mimic what they see. So make sure you are showing these positive things you want your children to be doing, that school is a priority, we sit down, we do it. But I will get to her as soon as I can, and I address the issue right away if she's having difficulty. And that's a great point, that if I am seeing that she's not catching something right there, I can be in there and be like, hey, I noticed that you had some trouble with these problems. Let's go through it right now. Let's continue to do it side by side, because I don't think you're ready to independently work this problem yet. And there's no shame in that. That's how we learn. So that would be an example for math. So math for my 7-year-old, she again does dimensions, and that looks a little different. So we do the textbook together. Usually not as many problems as the textbook has, because she catches on pretty quick. But with the workbook, I normally have to be in the room sitting next to her, and that's just focus issues for her. Again, this is kind of adjusting her. I expect her to be able to finish this, but I also know that with her focus issues, I have to be accommodating to that, the flexibility of it. So I will either be in the room or be sitting next to her, just to kind of nudge her and be like, hey, how's that math going? And it's not like get back to your work or can you focus? It's how is your math going? And that usually triggers her to remember, okay, I'm doing math. Because sometimes she does daydream, sometimes she does doodle, which is completely fine. But she also needs to get the work done as well. So just, again, rephrasing it, instead of saying, focus or do your math, it's how is your math going, giving her the opportunity to snap back to it, or if she has a question or if she's struggling, she can and then ask me, because again, communication is built upon, where my 11-year-old is fine saying, hey, I don't get this. My 7-year-old may be more hesitant to say, hey, I don't get this, or doesn't have the communication know-how to say what section she's not quite getting. That's something that comes over time, but I'm right there. And then for my youngest, my 4.5-year-old, he does 2 pages of math workbook. And what I do with him is that he has the option of doing more. That's his option. That's his choice I put in there. So the expectation is we do 2 pages. And if he wants to do more, That's absolutely his choice. Sometimes he does 3 or 4 pages. Sometimes he just wants to do the 2 pages. But again, that little sense of control in this situation really does help him, especially since he's more stubborn. That those are examples of having guidelines, having, parameters. I want this to be done. This is what I expect of the work to be done. Your math workbook, your textbook done independently. I've laid out what it is. Make sure they have the skill ability to reach it. So let's talk about a group subject. So let's talk about history or science, because that's what my 2 oldest do. So again, consistency I think is key here. We've gone through, we're on 2-3 months into homeschool now. We started at the beginning of August. So they know the flow of history and science. The nice thing about core knowledge is, and I'll link up above because I talked about how I use these specifically if you want to see kind of that actual scaffolding I do. But core knowledge is very, I don't want to say repetitive because people are going to be like, oh, that's so boring. But it follows the same structure model. You read some chapters, you have some questions within those chapters, and then you have things called learning labs, where you're diving deeper, you're looking at primary source documents, you're learning how to analyze primary source documents. The learning labs are all different. Sometimes it's listening to a podcast and debating, which I love that the learning labs are always different. But the structure stays the same. It's always, the chapters, the first couple days, we get through the information, the questions, deeper thinking, and then we go into the learning labs, which kind of pull more into that. But they're familiar with how it runs. And that makes it easier that, okay, when we sit down for history, everybody knows what's expected of them. I expect my kids to be able to listen. They're welcome to color or build or play with clay, whatever they want to do, as long as they're actively listening. And I can tell they're actively listening, not because they're staring at me in the face, but because they're able to answer those questions that come either during the chapter reading or at the end of the chapter reading. That tells me that they are listening and getting the information down. And with history, there's not a lot of written work. They do have assessments at the end of certain chapters, or midway through the year there's a large assessment, or what you would consider a final type thing or midterm. But a lot of that is just orally discussing things. But I can tell my kids are learning and retaining that information. So the expectation is you sit or walk around after my 7-year-old. Do whatever you want with your hands, color, whatever, but actively listening, be able to actively participate in the questions. Because again, if they're not capable of answering these questions, I know that the lesson didn't sink in. Either I wasn't doing something well enough with the teaching, or they weren't paying attention. So again, making sure they have skill abilities. But for example, something with science, that one does have physical things you have to do with it. So the expectation in science is that we complete whatever the lesson is for that day. Usually there's an experiment, and then with a lab, and like a lab sheet, and then there's reading the chapter. And again, it follows a very similar format. I know how people are like, I hate doing repetitive stuff, but guess what? Your kids probably don't hate it as much as you do. I think a lot of parents actually end up switching things up because they are bored and the monotony of homeschooling is getting to them. But a lot of kids do benefit from repetition. And again, it's not necessarily the same information every day, but having a similar format or flow does really help their brains catch on quicker, and you're going to get less of that pushback from kids because they know what's happening, they know what's going on. So with science, obviously the expectations of my 7-year-old are to listen, that she's welcome to participate in the experiments, she likes to do the pouring or the measuring or all that. The expectations for my oldest would be different because her skill set is different. She's expected to fill out, like I said when we were doing the photosynthesis, she's expected to fill out the lab sheets and the diagrams. Well, I have changed that expectation for my younger child that's more age appropriate to her skill level. So ultimately, I think when we help kids meet, so how do we help kids meet these expectations? By ensuring they have the skill ability to do what we want for the final product. And I do talk about this, I'll link up above how I adjust curriculum for my kids instead of swapping it. I have specific examples in there for my 11-year-old and my 7-year-old. But honestly, homeschooling takes a lot of self-reflection. It takes a lot of detective work. You have to figure out the why, what's going on with your kids, and really dive into that, because like I've said in so many of my videos, it's often not the curriculum that's the problem. It's often something you're doing, something you're not doing, something didn't clearly get across to your child, a lot of it is on us. And I can see the unpopularity of talking about that. I'm asking you to do more work. I'm asking you to put more effort into it. And that's kind of opposite of, this is pretty and fun and exciting. But this is homeschooling. This is education. This is really important for your kids. I'm not saying it can't be fun or all those things, but you also have to have the boring stuff in there too. You have to have, in order to progress and learn it, you gotta have some consistency. You gotta have these clear expectations for your children. And the best way they're gonna meet those expectations is if you make sure they have the skills, ability to get to the expectations. And making sure you're teaching those skills directly, direct instruction. So that is kind of how I work expectations in my homeschooling, how I kind of scaffold, but really it's down to what's the expectation, what's the final product you want, backtracking to see the skill abilities that your child needs to reach that. And again, I do think, and I talked about this in my other video too, that having these parameters for your child to work in and that they know what's expected of them makes it easier for them, and you're going to get less pushback, because like I said in my previous video, when you get teenagers, you're getting pushback no matter what, just because of hormones and emotions. That when you have clear parameters set, you have clear expectations set, they can, flop back and forth, but within those clear expectations and parameters, you're going to have less of a fight on your hands. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any specific questions, let me know in the comments below. If not, thank you for watching.